Okay, folks, I know there's a bit of an echo in here, but you gotta bear with me. I'm recording in a bathroom right now. Not ideal, I know, but I am in a place that could basically only have it so that I record in here, or else the audio is gonna be absolutely terrible. Which I know because I just recorded 15 minutes of audio only to find out that it sounds absolutely atrocious. So this is about the best I can get at the moment. Regardless, I know this is a bit of a different thing than everyone in here is probably used to, but I got a little assignment that I've been doing for a geography class, and I figured that it would be more fun to make it into a YouTube video than just do it as a regular slideshow like it was requested, which did not make it easier in literally any capacity, so, you know, that's just how it is. Other than that, though, yeah, that's kind of it, so I'm gonna go through this. So, here is a geography class road trip by me, because I'm sure you all know who I am. So for starters, where exactly are we going? I mean, it's a road trip after all, so where are we heading on this amazing tour of ours down the country? Well, that would be the Gateway Arch. Now, why did I choose the Gateway Arch specifically? I'll mention that later on, but overall, I thought it was just kind of a silly place because you have National Park as the assignment, right? You're going on a road trip. Now, when you think National Park, you think of absolutely beautiful mountains, amazing scenery, incredible wildlife, just beautiful landscapes and all these crazy things. But then I realized that the Gateway Arch is a national park. It's a giant handbag handle. And that to me is absolutely hilarious. Now I know, it is definitely more of a important monument that I'm giving it credit for, but don't worry, I'll explain that in a second. But I just found that to be kind of hilarious, so I'm just listing it here. Regardless though, some of the actual specifics of the park location, I listed the latitude and longitude since that was a requirement, but overall this place sits directly within St. Louis, which is an extremely important city in the development of the United States. You have the trial of Dred and Harriet Scott and the women's suffrage case by Virginia Minor that all took place at the old courthouse over in St. Louis, which had a very substantial effect on the United States and how its laws are governed with both slavery and women's suffrage, so that pretty important. Now, the actual city also sits along the Mississippi River, which was also exceedingly important in the U.S., given the fact that everything west of it within the Louisiana Purchase was purchased, and that kind of doubled the entire size of the United States after that point. So the Gateway Arch itself serves as a nice little gateway between the courthouse and the Mississippi River to show the absolutely immense amount of importance that they both showed with the entirety of the country, with the old courthouse sitting on one end and the Mississippi River sitting on the other, with the Gateway Arch between the two. So definitely a very important monument. Now, as said, this is a road trip, so we have to take a route, and while I figured that it would definitely be a fun place to go to, I kind of underestimated just how far away it was, because I only did the calculations to get there and forgot that I have to double it for all the way back. So in total, I gave myself about 2,400 miles of planned space that I have to go across, because I thought that I'd probably at least have some detours or some random spots, so I just popped that in there figuring it would make a little sense to go through there. Now, I run with my good old Toyota 4Runner with an 18 mile per gallon average for the gas tank, so that would require 134 gallons to get there and back, and about $450 for required gas. I just rounded it up from the slide because I figured that I'm not going to spend $440 specifically. Overall, though, that's the current standing of how we're going to get there. One requirement that I also had to place down was the hydrology as well as the fluvial geomorphology of the place in question. So I put a graph down from two respective places that I could have that could be listed here. The hydrograph in this slide I found from NOAA, so this lists all important information regarding the actual hydrology of the Mississippi River given near St. Louis. So that was something I figured I'd place down. And for the fluvial geomorphology, I actually found it from an old PDF that I found online. So I'm going to link that in the description of this because I kind of forgot explicitly what the company behind it was. All I know is that it was over 100 pages long and they had a lot of good information on that. Now, the weather and atmosphere of St. Louis is pretty nice, actually. You have, give or take, some wet springs, hot and humid summers, fairly cool falls, cool and damp winters. So it's not really all too bad. Not too dissimilar from Florida, where you have wet springs here constantly, like exceedingly rainy weather. I should probably say that instead of hot and humid summers, we have scorching and drenching summers, but you know, it's about as close as you can really get. And the same goes for the fall and the winter, where it's basically the same things there. That weather is, of course, caused by the fact that you have two different climate zones that this thing is directly smack dab between. You got hot and humid air from down in the Gulf of Mexico that goes straight up north, and then that heats up the place during the summers. And then from up north, you have cold air, which then moves south to cool down the city during the winters. Now, another segment of this is the rocks and the weathering of the location, and I took a little bit of a different approach with this. See, I realized that there's a place that is not horribly far from St. Louis that has a lot more to do with rocks and weathering than St. Louis and the Gateway Arch really would, so I decided I would use that as my place to go for this part. So with that being said, let's take a detour. Now, to where exactly? Where are we going to go that would possibly have a lot to do with just specifically rocks? That would be the cheese vaults in the Springfield cheese caves. Now, look, I know you have questions. Bear with me here, I will explain. See, for these types of projects, I like to get a little more crazy and do a little bit more of a fun aspect to it. So I tried to think of something I could do that related somewhat to the National Park project, but then would also be able to cover its own section. So as I was going through the National Park list, I realized something in the fact that I saw that there was one in Missouri. You know, you have that Gateway Arch, and what else is something in Missouri? Well, I panned through the back of my 4 collective memories in my brain to try to think of something, and I remembered that there is a certain location in Missouri that is absolutely hilarious to think about. And that, of course, would be the giant set of caverns that the US government used to store over 1 billion pounds of cheese. And that's why I chose the Gateway Arch, because it's about 3 hours away from this, and if I'm gonna go on a road trip, you better bet that I'm stopping at least once at the Missouri Cheese Caves. For a little more context, yeah, the US government had over 1 billion pounds of cheese set inside a bunch of limestone caverns / old mines that they were mining the limestone out of. Completely real. Entirely 100% real. I am not making this up. So going back to this is the actual rocks and weathering section. To simplify, it's essentially just a very, very large set of limestone mines because Missouri has a lot of limestone. As in, when I was looking it up, about 99% of the state has limestone at its surface, so you are not going to be pressed to find any. So it became a very good place to actually mine the stuff out and get a very large amount of it for roads, construction, whatever other purposes. It's got a lot of uses. So the actual rocks and weathering of this consisted, of course, primarily of limestone. And then the entirety of the weathering was mainly caused by humans because they were the ones to dig out the mines in the first place. So for some stuff on the surface, you used blasting with dynamite and a lot of other explosives and drilling and a crazy amount of other stuff that just absolutely annihilates the rock. So on the surface, that might have done quite a bit of stuff that would have moved around a lot of rock, that would have changed some of the nearby environment a little bit to accommodate the new features in the mine and all the equipment that was being brought in. But as for the actual underground stuff, once that main hole was dug and that big chamber initially was created where they blasted out a big old hunk of rock and then they start digging from there, not a lot really happens on the surface unless something would for some reason cause the thing to cave in, which it hasn't, which is why it's been used as a storage facility for the past like 40 years. It's gonna be pretty fine, and that it has been. So they realized that 2 things. Firstly, because it's such a big giant open cavern and the mines have been used up, that it is a pretty good place to store stuff, because otherwise it's just a giant empty hole in the ground that no one really knows what to do with. And by hole in the ground, I mean it's effectively invisible because it's underground. That and a lot of these underground areas are really good for storing things in a pretty constant state, because overall the temperature tends to be pretty constant, but if it's not, you can make a temperature a certain thing down there and then it will tend to stay there with very minimal stuff to keep it like that. I mean, granted, there is a cooling system, of course, and it keeps it about 36 degrees Fahrenheit at all times of the year, so it all stays very, very nice and cool, and it basically just all sits in cold storage. But the fact that it's a giant cavern just full of stone, and the stone can retain that coolness pretty well, definitely helps out a bit instead of just making it a giant air-conditioned room. Yes, the main deal of it all, big old cavern, absolutely full of cheese, just like top to bottom, there's a lot. And that's pretty great. Now, I've explained what this is, but I bet any person looking at this is wondering, why? Why? Just why? Well, let me tell you. So in the 1970s, the United States had a very large amount of dairy production with its farmers, but suddenly there was a little bit less of demand. And by a little less, I mean there was a lot. There was a very large amount of demand that was just suddenly not wanted anymore. People just weren't as big on milk or dairy at the time. If you have a lot of production and a lot of stuff being made, but then suddenly you have a lot less people that want your product, then 2 things are going to happen. Either you are going to lower your prices and everything's going to be dirt cheap, or if people still don't want to buy it, you are going to have to keep or toss a lot of that other product because nobody's going to take it. So when the US government found out that there were like billions of gallons of milk that were going to be tossed away, they realized that they kind of needed to do something about that to avoid wasting so much food. So they did the only natural thing that any group of people would do, being that they bought all of the milk and then they turned it into cheese and then they kept it into cold storage so that they wouldn't waste all the food. This is where the saying government cheese comes from, and it's not the fact that it is money, it's the fact that literally they would give out cheese to people who who needed food. So they give it to food banks or schools and cafeterias where then they would basically just use it like any way they could possibly find. Put it on sandwiches, basically cook with it, do literally anything you want, but it was effectively just a good way to get people food even if it wasn't good. From what I've read, it is not a good cheese, let me assure you, it is very, very not the best. So what does this end up with? We have the final human impact of all of this in the entirety of the cheese vault, which, yeah, it's still an insane sentence all on its own. These caves are mainly just used as food stores and have still been used as food stores up to this day, and have basically been just used to give out food to food banks. Anyone who really needs more food than they're able to achieve or get. So back when that initial project from the government started, it was exceedingly helpful. Even if the cheese wasn't good, it was still giving people a source of food which they otherwise would not have been able to get. Now the place half belongs to private companies and it also belongs to the government, so it's a bit split between the two, and is being used under the FarmLink project to basically do the same things initially stated, where they would give food to those who need it and just allocate all of those resources to places where they wouldn't just be sitting in a giant hunk of rock under the ground. That and some of the companies who do own the cheese are also trying to sell it off because there's so much of it that it's not just that easy to just give it out completely. Apparently there's a lot of logistical issues which, you know, I would think to just give it away, but I'm not the owner of all the cheese, so I don't know how easy that is to do. Transportation probably cost a lot, so that's fair. The final quote for this being cheddar for cheddar, cheese for cheese, because that's not only a really stupid pun, but you literally are paying for cheese, so there you go. And other than that, that's about it, I think. That is the current road trip thoughts. Which, yeah, for the actual road trip aspect, I would be driving from St. Louis to here, so that's kind of the gimmick I was going for. Go from home, St. Louis, cheese caves, home. Which, even if I can't directly visit the cheese caves, because I do believe they are somewhat owned by places that wouldn't let me in, I definitely go over to the general area and make a video about it while I'm there. If I ever do go, which, I mean, honestly, at this point, I plan on. So other than that, that's about it, I think. I'll see you later.